At 62 years old, Ruth Chamberlain's family saw her as nothing but an unwanted burden. After overhearing that her presence was a decades-long weight on her son's household, she made a choice everyone called insane. She took her last $100 and moved to the Nebraska wilderness to claim 160 acres of raw prairie. At an age when most women were settling into quiet retirement, Ruth was digging a hole in the ground to build a home of her own. This is the story of how a grandmother traded a life of comfortable dependency for a brutal battle for her own dignity. Ruth had been widowed in 1882 when her husband George Chamberlain had died at age 65 after 40 years of farming rented land in Illinois. And George's death had created financial circumstances that had left Ruth with limited options for supporting herself during the years that had remained to her. George and Ruth had raised 4 children during their marriage, 2 sons and 2 daughters, who'd all survived to adulthood and who'd all married and established their own households by the time George had died. The Chamberlain family had never been prosperous despite George's decades of agricultural work, and when he'd died, he'd left Ruth with approximately $100 in savings and with no property beyond personal possessions and household goods that had minimal monetary value. The rented farm where they'd lived had reverted to its owner upon George's death, and Ruth had been forced to vacate the house and to make arrangements for living elsewhere. The eldest son, Thomas Chamberlain, had been 38 years old in 1882 and had been farming his own rented land in Illinois with his wife Margaret and their 4 children. Thomas had offered to take Ruth into his household after George's death, and Ruth had accepted the arrangement because she'd had no other immediate options and because she'd believed that living with family would be preferable to attempting to support herself through domestic work or through dependence on charity from community organizations. Ruth had moved into Thomas and Margaret's household in April of 1882, and the arrangement had been difficult from the beginning in ways that Ruth had tried to attribute to normal adjustment challenges, but that had actually reflected fundamental tensions about space, authority, and the proper role of elderly widows in households managed by younger women. The Chamberlain farmhouse had been small, 3 rooms that had needed to accommodate Thomas, Margaret, their 4 children ranging in age from 3 to 12, and now Ruth, who'd required sleeping space and who'd occupied areas that had previously been used for other purposes. Margaret Chamberlain had been a capable household manager who'd developed efficient systems for cooking, cleaning, childcare, and the countless other domestic tasks that frontier farm life had required, and Ruth's presence had disrupted those systems in ways that had created friction even when Ruth had tried to be helpful rather than burdensome. Margaret had organized her kitchen in specific ways that had made sense to her, and when Ruth had attempted to assist with cooking, she'd often rearranged items or had used different techniques that had frustrated Margaret and had led to tense conversations about whose methods should prevail in a household that Margaret had been managing for 15 years. The children had been another source of tension because Ruth had been a grandmother who'd naturally wanted to interact with her grandchildren and who'd sometimes contradicted Margaret's parenting decisions in ways that had undermined Margaret's authority. When Margaret had disciplined children for misbehavior, Ruth had sometimes intervened to defend the children or to suggest that Margaret's discipline had been too harsh, and the interventions had created conflicts between Ruth and Margaret that had been difficult to resolve because Ruth had been Thomas's mother and had held status within the family that had made direct confrontation uncomfortable for Margaret. Thomas had been caught between loyalty to his mother and loyalty to his wife, and he'd attempted to mediate disputes by suggesting that both women should try to be more accommodating and more understanding of each other's perspectives. But the mediation had been ineffective because the fundamental problem hadn't been lack of accommodation or understanding. It had been the structural reality that the household hadn't been large enough or prosperous enough to comfortably support 7 people, and that Ruth's presence had been creating burdens that Margaret had resented even when she'd been too polite to express those resentments directly. By the winter of 1883 to 1884, Ruth had been living with Thomas's family for nearly 2 years, and she'd become increasingly aware that her presence was causing problems that were affecting the family's well-being and harmony. She'd overheard Margaret complaining to Thomas about how Ruth's presence had made household management more difficult, and she'd noticed that Margaret had been making pointed comments about how expensive it was to feed and clothe an additional adult who wasn't contributing income to the household. The breaking point had come in February of 1884, during a conversation Ruth had overheard between Thomas and Margaret, when they'd believed Ruth had been sleeping, and when they'd been discussing whether they should ask Ruth to consider moving to live with one of her other children instead of remaining indefinitely with Thomas's family. Margaret had been blunt in expressing her frustration. "Thomas, I know she's your mother, but I can't continue managing this household with her here. She interferes with how I raise the children, she rearranges my kitchen every time I turn around, and she takes up space we need for our own family. I want you to talk to your mother about moving to live with Robert or with one of your sisters. We've done our duty by housing her for 2 years. Now it's someone else's turn." Thomas had been reluctant to confront his mother about leaving, but he'd acknowledged that Margaret's concerns had been legitimate. "I'll talk to her." "But where is she supposed to go? Robert's house is even smaller than ours, and my sisters have their own families and their own problems. Mother is 62 years old, and she has nowhere else to go. What am I supposed to tell her?" Margaret's response had been delivered with tone that had made clear she'd been at the end of her patience. "Tell her that we love her and that we want what's best for her, but that we can't continue supporting her indefinitely. She needs to find some other arrangement, whether that's living with another family member or finding some kind of work that would allow her to support herself. I'm not willing to spend the next 20 years sharing my house with your mother while she criticizes how I run my household." Ruth had lain awake for hours after overhearing the conversation, and she'd been forced to confront the reality that her presence in Thomas's household had been creating resentment and tension that would only worsen over time if she remained. The phrase Margaret had used, "the next 20 years," had been particularly painful because it had made clear that Margaret had been viewing Ruth's residence as a potentially decades-long burden rather than as a temporary arrangement that would end when Ruth died in the near future. The realization that she'd become a burden to her own children had been devastating for Ruth in ways that had gone beyond simple wounded pride or hurt feelings. She'd spent 40 years raising her children and managing George's household, and she'd believed that those decades of work had earned her the right to expect support from her family during her final years. But the conversations she'd overheard had made clear that familial obligation had limits, and that her children viewed supporting her as a burden they'd been willing to accept temporarily, but that they weren't willing to sustain indefinitely. The decision Ruth had made in late February of 1884 had been driven by determination to maintain dignity and independence rather than to continue living as an unwanted dependent in households managed by children who'd resented her presence. Ruth had remembered hearing about the Homestead Act years earlier, and she'd known that the act had allowed unmarried women and widows to file claims and to prove land through the same requirements that had applied to men. The idea of homesteading at age 62 had seemed absurd when it had first occurred to her. But as Ruth had considered her alternatives, she'd concluded that proving a homestead claim would be preferable to spending the remainder of her life moving between her children's households while being resented and while feeling like a burden. Ruth had possessed $100 that George had left her, and she'd concluded that the money would be adequate to pay filing fees, to purchase basic tools and supplies, and to sustain her for several months while she'd established her claim. The work would be physically demanding in ways that would test whether a 62-year-old woman could manage frontier agriculture. But Ruth had been healthy and had been physically capable despite her age, and she believed that determination and experience might compensate for whatever strength she'd lost compared to younger homesteaders. The conversation Ruth had with Thomas about her decision to homestead had occurred in early March of 1884, and Thomas's reaction had been exactly what Ruth had anticipated: shock, disbelief, and insistence that the plan was impossible and dangerous. "Mother, you're 62 years old. Homesteading requires 5 years of continuous residence and agricultural work. You'll be 67 when you finish proving, if you survive that long. The physical labor will kill you, and even if it doesn't, you'll be living alone on isolated prairie land without family nearby to help you. This is insane." Ruth had defended her decision with calm that had been partly genuine conviction and partly performance designed to convince Thomas that she'd thought through the plan carefully. "Thomas, I've been living in your house for 2 years, and I'm aware that Margaret resents my presence and wants me to leave. I could move to Robert's house or to one of your sister's houses, but the same problems would occur wherever I went, because the fundamental issue is that I'm a burden to my children and I have no way to support myself independently. Homesteading will allow me to own land and to live on my own terms rather than being dependent on children who don't want me in their homes. Thomas had protested that Ruth was exaggerating Margaret's resentment and that she'd always be welcome in his household. But his protests had been unconvincing because both he and Ruth had known they'd been contradicted by the conversation Ruth had overheard. Margaret had been present during the discussion, and her failure to contradict Ruth's characterization of her resentment had been acknowledgement enough that Ruth's assessment had been accurate. Ruth had traveled to the land office in Beatrice, Nebraska in mid-March of 1884, and she'd filed a homestead claim on a quarter section located approximately 15 miles northwest of the town in an area that had been sparsely settled and that had offered the isolation Ruth had wanted. The land office clerk had been surprised to be processing a filing from a 62-year-old woman, and he'd asked questions that had been designed to verify that Ruth understood the requirements and the challenges she'd be facing. Mrs. Chamberlain, homesteading requires 5 years of continuous residence, cultivation of land, and construction of permanent improvements. The work is physically demanding, and most people who attempt to prove claims are in their 20s or 30s. Are you certain you want to proceed with this filing at your age? Ruth had been certain despite recognizing that the clerk's concerns had been reasonable. I'm aware of the requirements, and I'm confident I can meet them. I've been managing households and performing farm work for 40 years. The fact that I'm 62 doesn't mean I'm incapable of homesteading. The quarter section Ruth had claimed had been rolling prairie land with a small creek providing water and with soil that appeared adequate for cultivation. There had been no structures and no improvements, which had meant Ruth would need to build everything herself, using the limited money she'd brought from Illinois and using whatever labor she could provide through her own physical effort. The first structure Ruth had built had been a dugout excavated into a hillside, the same type of basic shelter that most homesteaders had constructed during their first months on claims. Ruth had never done construction work before, but she'd approached the task methodically, and she'd completed a functional dugout approximately 9 feet wide and 11 feet deep in late March, after 2 weeks of sustained digging and hauling. The physical labor had been exhausting and had reminded Ruth that she was 62 rather than 32, but she'd discovered that she was still capable of sustained heavy work even if she'd needed more rest breaks and more recovery time than younger homesteaders would have required. The spring planting had been Ruth's introduction to farming as a primary operator, rather than as a wife assisting her husband, and she'd discovered that managing agricultural work independently required skills and judgment that she'd developed only partially during her years helping George. Ruth had decided to plant 8 acres during her first spring, a modest amount compared to what experienced farmers had cultivated, but adequate to demonstrate agricultural improvement and to provide grain for her own consumption and for generating minimal cash income. The plowing had been accomplished using oxen Ruth had borrowed from a neighboring homesteader named Frank Wilson, who'd been a man in his 40s who'd been farming the quarter section adjacent to Ruth's claim with his wife and 3 children. Wilson had been skeptical about Ruth's homesteading prospects, and he'd made his assessment clear when he delivered the oxen to her claim. Mrs. Chamberlain, I respect what you're trying to do, but I don't think you understand how difficult homesteading is going to be at your age. Plowing 8 acres will take you at least 2 weeks if you've never managed oxen before, and that's assuming you don't injure yourself or exhaust yourself to the point where you can't continue. Most women your age are living with their children and helping with grandchildren, not trying to prove homestead claims alone. Ruth had thanked Wilson for his concern, but had proceeded with the plowing despite his skepticism. The work had been even more difficult than she'd anticipated, because the oxen had been unfamiliar with her commands and had been resistant to following instructions from someone who'd lacked confidence in managing them. Ruth had spent the first several days simply learning how to control the animals and how to guide the plow in ways that created reasonably straight furrows, and the learning process had been frustrating and had been marked by numerous mistakes and by frequent need to repeat work that hadn't been done correctly the first time. But Ruth had persisted despite the difficulties, and by late April she'd completed adequate plowing of 8 acres and had planted the land with wheat using seed she'd purchased in Beatrice. The planting had been accomplished using methods Ruth had learned from watching George work during their decades of marriage, and while her technique hadn't been as efficient as what experienced farmers had achieved, it had been adequate to establish crop that had reasonable prospects for producing harvestable grain. By late May of 1884, Ruth had been living on her homestead for approximately 2 months, and she'd established basic residence through her dugout and had begun agricultural improvement through her planted wheat. But she'd also discovered that homesteading at age 62 had been creating challenges that had gone beyond just physical labor and that had included social isolation and psychological adjustment to living alone after decades of being part of a family household. The first visit from Ruth's grandchildren had occurred in early June, when Thomas had brought his 4 children to see their grandmother's homestead during a trip to Beatrice for supplies. The children had ranged in age from 5 to 14, and they'd been curious about the dugout and about the quarter section their grandmother had been attempting to prove. The eldest granddaughter, Emily, who'd been 14, had been particularly interested in Ruth's motivations and had asked questions that had been more perceptive than what Ruth had expected from a teenage girl. "Grandmother, why are you living here alone instead of living with us? Mother says you left because you wanted independence, but that doesn't make sense. You have family who'd take care of you. Why would you choose to live in a hole in the ground on prairie land instead of living in a real house with people who love you?" Ruth had answered honestly, while also trying to explain in terms Emily could understand. "Emily, I love your family, and I appreciate that your father offered to let me live with you. But living in someone else's household when you're my age means being dependent and being a burden. I spent 40 years managing my own household, and I don't want to spend my final years being someone else's unwanted responsibility. Homesteading gives me the chance to own land and to live independently, rather than being dependent on children who resent having to support me." Emily had been troubled by the suggestion that her mother had resented Ruth's presence, but she hadn't contradicted Ruth's characterization because she'd been aware of tensions in the household that had existed before Ruth had left. The visit had been brief, and Thomas had departed with his children after staying only long enough to verify that Ruth had been managing adequately and hadn't been in immediate danger of starving or of being unable to care for herself. But the visit had also reminded Ruth of what she'd given up by choosing to homestead rather than to continue living with family. She'd been lonely during the weeks she'd spent alone on her claim, and seeing her grandchildren had made her acutely aware that independence came with costs that included separation from family connections and from the daily interactions with children and grandchildren that had been one of the few pleasures she'd experienced while living with Thomas's family. The summer of 1884 had been characterized by steady agricultural work, punctuated by occasional visits from neighbors and from family members who'd been checking on Ruth's welfare and who'd been curious about whether a 62-year-old grandmother could actually succeed at homesteading. Frank Wilson had visited several times to offer advice about farming techniques and to provide assistance with tasks that had required more strength or more skill than Ruth had possessed, and his help had been valuable even though it had come with continued skepticism about Ruth's long-term prospects. By August of 1884, 5 months into her homesteading effort, Ruth had established that she was physically capable of managing basic farm work despite her age, and that she was committed to completing the 5-year proving period regardless of how difficult the work might be or how isolated she might feel living alone on prairie land 15 miles from the nearest town. Her wheat had been growing adequately, her dugout was providing acceptable shelter, and she'd been surviving on minimal income supplemented by the savings she'd brought from Illinois. But Ruth had also been aware that the first 5 months had been the easiest part of her proving period because the weather had been moderate and because her physical strength hadn't yet been tested by the kind of intensive labor that harvest would require or by the kind of harsh conditions that winter would bring. The approaching harvest would be the first real test of whether a 62-year-old woman could complete agricultural work that had challenged men half her age, and the winter that would follow would test whether Ruth could survive months of isolation and cold in a dugout that had been barely adequate for summer living, and that might prove dangerously inadequate when temperatures dropped below zero. The first harvest Ruth Chamberlain attempted, as a 62-year-old homesteader, occurred in September of 1884. and it represented a test of whether she possessed the physical stamina and the technical skill necessary to complete agricultural work that had required sustained heavy labor over periods of days or weeks. The wheat she'd planted in late April had matured adequately despite her inexperience, and despite the challenges of managing cultivation while learning basic farming techniques. But cutting, bundling, and threshing grain required different skills and different types of physical effort than plowing and planting had demanded. Ruth had purchased a scythe in Beatrice before beginning her harvest, and she'd spent several days practicing the sweeping motion required to cut wheat efficiently without exhausting herself or without creating irregular cutting patterns that would waste grain or make bundling difficult. The technique had been harder to master than Ruth had anticipated, because the scythe had required coordinated full-body movement rather than just arm strength, and maintaining the rhythm for hours at a time had been exhausting in ways that had reminded Ruth constantly that she was 62 rather than 32. The actual harvest work had taken Ruth nearly 2 weeks to complete for the 8 acres she'd planted, and by the end of each day, she'd been so exhausted that she'd barely been able to prepare minimal food before collapsing in her dugout to sleep. The bundling had been accomplished through methods Ruth had learned from watching George work during their decades of marriage, and while her technique hadn't been as efficient as what experienced farmers had achieved, she'd managed to create bundles adequate for transporting grain to the threshing location. The threshing had been the most challenging aspect of the harvest because Ruth had lacked access to a threshing machine and had been forced to thresh her grain by hand using a flail, a slow and inefficient process that had resulted in significant grain loss and that had been physically demanding enough that Ruth had needed to work in short intervals with frequent rest breaks rather than attempting to thresh continuously for hours as younger farmers had done. The total yield from Ruth's 8 acres had been approximately 25 bushels of wheat, a yield of roughly 3 bushels per acre that had been well below what experienced farmers had achieved from comparable land, but that had been adequate to demonstrate genuine agricultural production and to provide seed for the following year's planting, along with modest surplus for sale or for personal consumption. Frank Wilson had visited Ruth's claim after her harvest had been completed, and he'd examined her bundled grain and had offered assessment that had been more encouraging than his previous skeptical comments had suggested he would deliver. "Mrs. Chamberlain, I'll admit I didn't think you'd make it through your first harvest. Most women your age couldn't manage the physical work, and most people without farming experience produce even worse yields than you achieved. 25 bushels from 8 acres isn't impressive by professional standards, but it's adequate for a first-year homesteader, and it proves you're capable of actual farming rather than just occupying land. If you can maintain this level of production for 5 years, you'll prove your claim successfully." Ruth had been grateful for Wilson's encouragement, but she'd also been realistic about how difficult maintaining production would be as she aged through her 60s, and as her physical capabilities declined from their current levels. She'd felt the effects of harvest work in her joints and in her muscles, and she'd recognized that recovery from sustained labor was taking longer than it would have taken when she'd been younger. The sale of surplus grain had generated approximately $12 in cash income after Ruth had reserved seed for spring planting. And while that amount had been minimal, it had been adequate to purchase supplies that Ruth had needed for winter and to demonstrate that her farming operation was generating actual income rather than just consuming the savings she'd brought from Illinois. The first winter Ruth experienced as a homesteader had been characterized by isolation that had been more psychologically difficult than the physical hardships of cold weather and limited food. Ruth had been living alone in her dugout for weeks at a time without seeing another person, and the silence and the emptiness had been oppressive in ways that had made her question whether maintaining independence had been worth the cost of complete separation from family and from community. The loneliness had been particularly intense during the Christmas season of 1884, when Ruth had been acutely aware that her children and grandchildren were celebrating together while she'd been alone on her claim with no company beyond the few chickens she'd purchased to provide eggs. Ruth had considered traveling to Thomas's house for Christmas, but she'd decided against it because she'd been afraid that visiting would remind her of what she'd given up by choosing to homestead and would weaken her resolve to complete the 5-year proving period. But Thomas had appeared at Ruth's dugout on Christmas morning with all 4 of his children bringing food and small gifts that the grandchildren had made for their grandmother. The visit had been brief because Thomas had needed to return home before dark, but it had provided Ruth with human contact and with reminder that her family hadn't forgotten her, even though she'd chosen to live separately from them. Emily, who'd been 15 years old, had been shocked by the conditions in which her grandmother was living and had expressed concerns that had reflected both genuine worry and teenage inability to imagine choosing isolation over family connection. "Grandmother, you're living in a hole in the ground with barely any food and no one to talk to for weeks at a time. This is miserable. Why don't you give up the homestead and come back to live with us? I know Mother was difficult sometimes, but this can't be better than living with family." Ruth had explained her reasoning while also acknowledging that Emily's concerns had been understandable. "Emily, living with your family meant being a burden and being resented. Living here means being independent and being responsible only for myself. Yes, it's lonely, and yes, the conditions are harsh. But I prefer difficult independence to comfortable dependency, and I'm committed to proving this claim, even if it means spending winters alone." Thomas had been troubled by Ruth's living conditions and had offered to provide her with additional supplies or with money to make her situation more comfortable. But Ruth had declined assistance beyond the food and gifts he'd already brought because she'd been determined to prove that she could manage independently without requiring regular support. The spring of 1885 had brought Ruth's second planting season as a homesteader, and the work had been noticeably more difficult than her first year's planting had been because she'd been 63 years old and because the physical demands of her first year's farming had taken a toll on her body that had been visible in increased joint pain and in reduced stamina for sustained labor. Ruth had decided to expand her cultivation to 12 acres during her second year, an increase of 50% over her first year's planting that she'd hoped would demonstrate agricultural improvement and would generate increased income that might make her homesteading more financially sustainable. But the expanded cultivation had required proportionally more plowing and planting work, and Ruth had discovered that her 63-year-old body wasn't capable of increasing labor output as easily as she'd hoped. The plowing had been accomplished over a period of 3 weeks rather than the 2 weeks it had taken during her first year, and Ruth had needed to work shorter days and to take more frequent rest breaks to avoid exhausting herself to the point where she couldn't continue. Frank Wilson had offered to help with the plowing, but Ruth had declined because she'd been determined to prove that she could manage agricultural work independently, even if that meant working more slowly than younger farmers would have worked. But Ruth had accepted help from an unexpected source when her daughter Sarah Bennett had arrived at the homestead in late April with her 2 teenage children, a 16-year-old son named David and a 14-year-old daughter named Clara. Sarah had been Ruth's second child and had been 36 years old in 1885, and she'd traveled from Illinois specifically to help her mother with spring planting because she'd been concerned about whether Ruth could manage the work alone at her age. "Mother, I know you want to prove you can homestead independently, but there's no shame in accepting help from family when you need it. David and Clara are strong enough to help with planting, and I can assist with lighter work. We'll stay for 2 weeks to help you get your crops in the ground, and then we'll return home. You'll still be proving the claim on your own. We're just helping with the hardest work of the year." Ruth had been torn between gratitude for Sarah's offer and concern that accepting help would undermine her claim that she was farming independently. But she'd eventually concluded that seasonal assistance from family members didn't violate the spirit of homesteading, and that refusing help out of excessive pride would be foolish when the alternative might be failing to plant adequately and risking. The planting had been completed efficiently with Sarah's family's help, and the presence of her daughter and grandchildren had provided Ruth with company and conversation that had reminded her of what she'd been missing during the months she'd spent living alone. David and Clara had been cheerful and energetic workers who'd treated the planting as an adventure rather than as the grinding labor it actually was, and their youthful enthusiasm had been infectious enough that Ruth had found herself enjoying farm work more than she had when she'd been laboring alone. But Sarah's visit had also included difficult conversations about Ruth's long-term plans and about whether she truly intended to complete the 5-year proving period or whether she might eventually decide to give up the homestead and return to living with family. Mother, I understand why you left Thomas's house, and I don't blame you for wanting independence. But homesteading at your age is dangerous, and I worry about you living alone out here where no one can help you if you get sick or injured. Have you thought about what you'll do if your health declines to the point where you can't manage farm work anymore? You'll be 67 when you finish proving. Will you actually be able to work this land at that age, or are you just postponing the inevitable return to living with family? Ruth had answered honestly, while also defending her right to make decisions about her own life, even if those decisions seemed impractical to younger people. Sarah, I don't know if I'll be able to farm at 67, but I'm capable of farming now at 63, and I intend to continue for as long as my health allows. If I reach a point where I can't manage the work anymore, I'll make decisions then about what to do next. But I'm not going to give up my independence just because you think I'm too old to farm, or because you're worried I might not survive to complete my proving. Sarah had departed after 2 weeks with her children, and Ruth had been left alone again to manage her cultivation through the summer growing season. The wheat and corn she'd planted had grown adequately with assistance from favorable weather. And by late summer, Ruth had been anticipating a harvest that would be larger than her first year's production, and that would demonstrate that she was improving as a farmer despite her age. But the expanded cultivation had meant that the harvest work would be proportionally more difficult, and Ruth had been aware that cutting, bundling, and threshing 12 acres of grain would test her physical limits in ways that might reveal whether she was actually capable of sustaining homesteading through the remaining 3 years of her proving period. The harvest of 1885 had been accomplished over a period of nearly 3 weeks, and Ruth had needed to pace herself carefully to avoid injury or exhaustion that might prevent her from completing the work. The cutting had been managed through shorter working days and through accepting that progress would be slower than what younger farmers achieved, and the bundling and threshing had been completed using the same hand methods Ruth had employed during her first harvest. The total yield from 12 acres had been approximately 40 bushels of wheat and 20 bushels of corn, yields that had represented substantial improvement over Ruth's first year, and that had demonstrated she was becoming more skilled at farming, even as her physical capabilities had been gradually declining with age. The cash income from selling surplus grain had been approximately $30, and Ruth had used the money to purchase a milk cow that would provide fresh milk and butter for her own consumption, and that would generate small amounts of additional income through sale of dairy products to neighbors or to merchants in Beatrice. The cow had been a significant investment that had consumed most of Ruth's harvest income, but it had represented diversification that would make her homesteading more sustainable, and that would reduce her dependence on grain sales as her sole source of cash. The second winter Ruth experienced as a homesteader had been similar to her first winter in terms of isolation and cold, but it had been psychologically easier because she'd had experience managing winter solitude and because she'd known from her first year that she was capable of surviving harsh conditions even when completely alone. The milk cow had provided company of a sort, and the daily routine of caring for the animal had given Ruth structured activity that had helped prevent the kind of oppressive loneliness she'd experienced during her first winter. The family visits had continued sporadically through the winter, with different children and grandchildren appearing at Ruth's claim to check on her welfare and to bring supplies or assistance. Thomas had visited twice, Sarah had sent letters with neighbors who'd been traveling to the area, and Ruth's youngest daughter, Rebecca, had visited in February with her 3 children who'd been curious about their grandmother's unusual living situation. But the visits had also reinforced Ruth's awareness that her children remained skeptical about her homesteading, and that they'd been expecting her to eventually give up the claim and return to living with family once the novelty had worn off, or once the physical demands had become too difficult for her to manage. Rebecca had been particularly direct in expressing doubts about Ruth's long-term prospects. "Mother, you've been homesteading for nearly 2 years, and I respect that you've survived this long. But you're 64 years old now, and you're going to be 67 when you finish proving. Do you honestly believe you'll be physically capable of farming at that age? Most people your age are slowing down significantly, and you're attempting to do work that exhausts men half your age." Ruth's response had been delivered with determination that had been partly genuine confidence and partly defensive performance, designed to convince Rebecca and herself that continuing was possible. "Rebecca, I'm aware that I'm aging and that farming will become more difficult as I get older, but I'm committed to completing my proving period, and I'll find ways to adapt my methods to accommodate whatever physical limitations develop. I didn't start homesteading to quit halfway through when the work gets harder. I started because I wanted to own land and to maintain independence, and those goals haven't changed just because I'm getting older. By December of 1885, Ruth had completed 21 months of proving on her homestead claim, and she demonstrated through 2 successful harvests that she was capable of farming despite her age and despite skepticism from family members who'd expected her to fail. Her cultivation had expanded, her yields had improved, and she'd established herself as a legitimate homesteader rather than just an elderly woman playing at farming while waiting to return to conventional retirement with her children's families. But Ruth had also been realistic about the challenges that remained. She had 3 years and 3 months of proving left to complete, and she would be 67 years old when she finished, an age when most people had been settling into final retirement rather than completing demanding agricultural work. The question that had been occupying Ruth's thoughts as winter had turned towards spring had been whether her determination and her experience would be sufficient to compensate for the physical decline that was inevitable as she aged through her mid-60s, or whether her children's skepticism would prove justified, and she would eventually be forced to abandon her claim because her body couldn't sustain the work her pride insisted she could complete. The final 3 years of Ruth Chamberlain's proving period were characterized by continued aging, by gradual adaptation of her farming methods to accommodate declining physical capabilities, and by slowly changing attitudes among her family members who'd initially viewed her homesteading as foolish stubbornness, but who'd gradually come to respect her determination and her success at proving that age didn't necessarily preclude agricultural competence. The spring of 1886 had brought Ruth's 3rd planting season as a homesteader, and she'd approached the work at age 64 with realistic assessment of her physical limitations combined with determination to complete the remaining 2 years of proving, regardless of how difficult the work might become. Ruth had decided to maintain cultivation of 12 acres, rather than attempting to expand further, because she'd recognized that her capacity for sustained heavy labor was declining, and that attempting to farm more land would risk exhausting herself to the point where she couldn't maintain adequate cultivation of any acreage. The ploughing had been accomplished over a period of 4 weeks during April and early May, twice as long as her first year's ploughing had required, and a full week longer than her second year's work had taken. The extended timeline had reflected both Ruth's reduced physical capacity and her deliberate choice to work at sustainable pace rather than pushing herself to complete ploughing quickly at the cost of injury or exhaustion that might prevent her from managing the rest of the season's agricultural work. Frank Wilson had visited during Ruth's ploughing and had offered assistance that he'd framed as neighborly cooperation rather than as charity to an elderly woman who couldn't manage on her own. "Mrs. Chamberlain, I'm planning to plough my south field this week, and it would be more efficient if I brought my team over to help finish your ploughing first. That way I can plough both fields in succession rather than making separate trips. Would you be willing to accept help on those terms?" Ruth had recognized that Wilson's offer had been motivated primarily by concern for her welfare rather than by actual farming efficiency, but she'd also appreciated his tact in presenting the assistance in ways that preserved her dignity and that avoided making her feel like a charity case. She'd accepted the help gratefully, and Wilson had completed Ruth's remaining ploughing in 2 days, work that would have taken Ruth another week if she'd continued laboring alone. The assistance had allowed Ruth to complete her planting on schedule and had conserved her energy for the summer cultivation work that would be essential for maintaining crop health through the growing season. But it had also represented acknowledgement that Ruth was increasingly dependent on assistance from neighbors for completing the heaviest farm work, and that her ability to farm truly independently was diminishing as she aged through her mid-60s. The harvest of 1886 had produced approximately 45 bushels of wheat and 25 bushels of corn from Ruth's 12 acres, yields that had been slightly improved over her second year and that had demonstrated she was maintaining agricultural productivity despite her advancing age. The harvest work had been accomplished over a period of 3 weeks, with assistance from Frank Wilson's teenage sons, who'd helped with the heaviest cutting and bundling work, while Ruth had managed the lighter tasks and had supervised the overall operation. The pattern of accepting selective assistance while maintaining overall management of her farming had become Ruth's standard approach during her third and fourth years of proving, and it had allowed her to continue agricultural production at levels adequate for proving her claim while acknowledging the reality that she couldn't perform all farm work independently anymore. The family visits had continued through 1886 and 1887, with various children and grandchildren appearing at Ruth's homestead during different seasons to check on her welfare, to provide assistance when needed, and to maintain family connections that distance and Ruth's chosen isolation had made difficult to sustain. The visits had evolved from expressions of skepticism and concern to acknowledgements of respect for what Ruth had accomplished, and several of Ruth's grandchildren had begun viewing their grandmother's homesteading as an inspirational example, rather than as the foolish stubbornness they'd initially perceived it to be. Emily, who'd been 18 years old in 1887, had visited Ruth's homestead in the summer with her younger siblings and had delivered an assessment that had surprised Ruth with its perceptiveness and its acknowledgement of what Ruth's homesteading represented. "Grandmother, when you first left to homestead, I thought you were making a terrible mistake. I couldn't understand why you'd choose to live alone in difficult conditions rather than staying with family where you'd be comfortable and cared for. But I've been thinking about what you said about being a burden and about wanting independence. And I'm starting to understand that you weren't running away from family. You were claiming the right to control your own life, rather than being dependent on children who resented having to support you. That takes courage I didn't appreciate when I was younger." Ruth had been moved by Emily's words and had used the conversation as an opportunity to explain her motivations more fully than she'd been able to articulate during her first difficult years of proving. "Emily, I love my children and my grandchildren, and leaving your father's household was one of the hardest decisions I've ever made. But living as an unwanted dependent would have been worse than living alone on a homestead. At least here, I'm responsible for myself and I'm building something that will be mine rather than spending my final years being a burden to people who don't want me in their homes. Homesteading has been difficult and lonely, but it's also been dignified in ways that dependency never could have been." The most significant family visit during Ruth's proving period had occurred in the autumn of 1887, when all four of Ruth's children and most of her grandchildren had gathered at her homestead for what amounted to a family reunion on the prairie land Ruth had been proving for 3.5 years. Thomas, Sarah, Robert, and Rebecca had all traveled to Nebraska with their families, and the gathering had included 14 people ranging in age from 7 to 42 who'd converged on Ruth's claim to celebrate her upcoming 66th birthday and to acknowledge that she was approaching completion of her 5-year proving period. The reunion had been organized by Sarah, who'd written to her siblings suggesting that they should recognize their mother's accomplishment before she completed her proving, rather than waiting until after she'd received her patent when the achievement would be already finished. The gathering had been chaotic and had been logistically challenging given the limited space in Ruth's cabin. She'd replaced her dugout with a small frame structure in 1886 using income from her harvests, but it had provided Ruth with opportunity to see her entire family together for the first time since George's funeral 5 years earlier. Thomas had used the gathering as an occasion to apologize for the household tensions that had driven Ruth to Homestead in the first place. "Mother, I want to apologize for how Margaret and I handled your living with us. We should have been more accommodating and we should have made you feel welcome rather than making you feel like a burden. I understand why you left, and I respect what you've accomplished by proving this claim. But I want you to know that you're always welcome in our home if you decide you don't want to continue farming after you receive your patent." Ruth had accepted the apology graciously, while also making clear that she didn't regret her decision to homestead, despite the difficulties it had created. "Thomas, I don't blame you or Margaret for the tensions that occurred when I was living in your household. The house was too small, and the resources were too limited to comfortably support everyone, and I understand that my presence created burdens. Homesteading has been hard, but it's also given me independence and dignity that I couldn't have had living as a dependent. I'm grateful for the offer to return to your home, but I intend to stay on my land for as long as my health allows me to manage it." The final year and a half of Ruth's proving period had been characterized by continued gradual decline in her physical capabilities, accompanied by continued adaptation of her farming methods to accommodate her limitations. By the spring of 1888, when Ruth had been 66 years old and had been approaching the final year of her proving, she'd been working at roughly half the pace she'd maintained during her first year, and she'd been dependent on assistance from Frank Wilson and from visiting family members for completing the heaviest agricultural work. But Ruth had maintained continuous residence on her claim throughout the entire proving period, and she'd continued managing cultivation of 12 acres, even when that management had increasingly involved supervising others' labor rather than performing all work herself. The distinction between independent farming and farming with assistance had been important to Ruth's sense of accomplishment, but she'd also recognized that the Homestead Act's requirements had focused on continuous residence and on agricultural improvement rather than on complete independence from all help, and that accepting assistance when necessary didn't invalidate her proving as long as she'd maintained primary responsibility for managing her homestead. The prove-up inspection that would determine whether Ruth would receive her patent had been conducted in February of 1889 by an inspector named Charles Morrison, who'd been examining claims throughout the region and who'd been familiar with unusual homesteading situations. Morrison had spent most of a day at Ruth's claim examining her improvements, measuring her cultivated acreage, interviewing her about her farming practices and her residence history, and asking questions about how she'd managed to complete a 5-year proving period while aging from 62 to 67. Morrison had been impressed by Ruth's accomplishment and had said so directly during their conversation. "Mrs. Chamberlain, I've been conducting prove-up inspections for 12 years, and I've never examined a claim proved by someone who started homesteading at your age. Most people who file claims in their 60s fail within the first year because the work is too demanding. The fact that you've completed 5 years of continuous residence and agricultural improvement while aging from 62 to 67 is remarkable and demonstrates exceptional determination." Morrison had also asked about the assistance Ruth had received from neighbors and from family members, and Ruth had answered honestly about how her farming had evolved from independent operation during her first 2 years to increasingly assisted operation during her final 3 years. "Mr. Morrison, I won't pretend I've farmed completely independently throughout my proving period. As I've aged, I've needed help with the heaviest work, and neighbors and family members have provided that help. But I've maintained continuous residence. I've managed my farming operation, and I've made permanent improvements, including constructing a cabin to replace my original dugout. I believe I've met the proving requirements, even though I've needed assistance to do so." Morrison had agreed that Ruth had met the requirements and had recommended approval of her patent without reservation. The Homestead Act requires continuous residence and agricultural improvement, but it doesn't require that claimants work completely alone without any assistance. Most homesteaders receive help from neighbors and family at various points during their proving periods. The fact that you've needed more assistance as you've aged doesn't invalidate your claim. It just demonstrates that you've been practical about adapting your methods to accommodate your physical limitations while still maintaining agricultural production. The patent had been issued in March of 1889, granting Ruth permanent title to the southwest quarter of Section 14, Township 9 North, Range 8 East in Gage County, Nebraska, 160 acres that she'd proven. Through 5 years of farming while aging from 62 to 67, and while demonstrating that determination and adaptability could compensate for physical limitations that would have defeated less stubborn homesteaders. The years following Ruth's patent approval had been characterized by continued farming on a gradually reducing scale as her physical capabilities had declined further, and as she'd transitioned from being a working farmer to being a landowner who'd leased portions of her land to younger farmers while maintaining residence in the cabin she'd built. By 1891, when Ruth had been 69 years old, she'd reduced her own cultivation to a small garden and had leased her cropland to Frank Wilson's sons, who'd paid her modest rent that had supplemented the income she'd received from selling eggs and butter. Ruth had continued living on her homestead until 1895, when declining health at age 73 had made independent living unsustainable and had forced her to make the decision she'd been avoiding since completing her proving, whether to sell her land or to move to live with family while retaining ownership. Ruth had chosen the latter option, selling her cabin and her livestock, but retaining ownership of her land, which she'd continued leasing to tenant farmers who'd paid rent that had provided Ruth with income during her final years. Ruth had moved to live with her daughter Sarah's family in Illinois in the autumn of 1895, and the arrangement had been dramatically different from her experience living with Thomas's family 13 years earlier. Sarah had welcomed Ruth warmly and had made clear that Ruth was an honored guest, rather than an unwanted burden, and the difference in reception had reflected both changed family dynamics and Ruth's changed status as a landowner who'd proven her capability and independence, rather than as a dependent widow who'd had no options beyond living with children who'd resented supporting her. Ruth had lived with Sarah's family for 6 years before dying peacefully in her sleep in January of 1901 at age 78. She'd spent the final years of her life surrounded by family and grandchildren who'd valued her presence and who'd respected the independence and determination she'd demonstrated through her homesteading experience. Ruth's funeral had been attended by all 4 of her children, by most of her grandchildren who'd been old enough to travel, and by several former neighbors from Nebraska, including Frank Wilson, who'd traveled to Illinois specifically to pay respects to the grandmother homesteader, who'd proven her claim despite age and despite skepticism from everyone who'd known her. Emily, who'd been 32 years old and who'd been married with children of her own, had delivered a remembrance at Ruth's funeral that had captured what her grandmother's homesteading had represented to the family and to the broader community. My grandmother, Ruth Chamberlain, homesteaded at age 62 when most people her age were settling into retirement with their families. She proved a claim over 5 years while aging to 67, and she did it not because she wanted to own land, but because she wanted to maintain dignity and independence rather than living as an unwanted dependent. She taught all of us that age doesn't determine capability, that independence is worth fighting for even when it's difficult, and that being a burden to family is worse than living alone in harsh conditions. She owned her land for 12 years before her health required her to move back to live with family, but during those 12 years, she lived on her own terms rather than on anyone else's terms. That's what homesteading meant to her, and that's what her life should mean to all of us who knew her. The land Ruth had proven had remained in the Chamberlain family for 2 generations after her death, farmed first by tenant operators and eventually by Ruth's grandson David, who'd helped with her planting during his teenage years and who'd filed his own adjacent homestead claim in 1898 after being inspired by his grandmother's example. David had purchased Ruth's original quarter section from the family estate after her death and had combined it with his own proven land to create a farm of 320 acres that had supported his family for decades. The legacy Ruth had created had extended beyond the land she'd proven to represent broader principles about aging, independence, and dignity that had resonated with family members and with community members who'd witnessed her accomplishment. She'd demonstrated that homesteading could be accomplished by people well past the age when most frontier farmers had been establishing claims, and she'd proven that determination and adaptability could compensate for physical limitations that would have seemed insurmountable to people who'd believed that only young, strong individuals could succeed at frontier agriculture. The grandmother who'd chosen difficult independence over comfortable dependency had shown that the final decades of life could be characterized by achievement and autonomy rather than by decline and dependence, and that the right to control one's own circumstances was worth fighting for regardless of age or regardless of social expectations about proper behavior for elderly widows. Ruth Chamberlain had homesteaded not because she'd wanted to be a farmer, but because she'd wanted to be free. And the 160 acres she'd proven had represented that freedom in ways that transcended mere land ownership and that had validated her choice to maintain dignity through her final years, regardless of the physical and emotional costs that choice had required.